When OA Karen called the cops to force me into joining her Lake HOA, she thought they'd drag me out in handcuffs. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just another neighbor she could bully. I was the one man the entire sheriff's department respected. So when the cruisers rolled up and the officers stepped out, Karen's smug grin vanished the moment they saluted me instead. What happened next turned her world upside down. Holy Karen had been on my case for as long as I could remember, marching up and down the neighborhood like she was some kind of queen guarding her throne. She carried her little clipboard like it was a weapon, her lips always pursing disapproval, ready to bark out a complaint or slap someone with a fine. But the truth was simple. My lake property wasn't part of her HOA, never had been and never would be. My cabin was on my own land and I didn't owe her a single penny. That fact never stopped her, though. Every week, sometimes every day, she would storm down to my place, demanding I sign her paperwork, demanding I hand over fees, demanding I bow down to her community rules. I ignored her every time, but ignoring Karen only made her more determined. She was the kind of person who thought persistence equaled power. One morning, just as the sun was lifting off the water and painting the lake in gold, she came strutting down my driveway like she owned it. Her hair was wild, her sunglasses perched on her nose like she was some celebrity about to make an announcement, and her voice already screeching before she even reached the porch. She screamed that I was a disgrace, that I was a problem, that I was bringing down property values by daring to exist outside her control. Then she announced with a smug little smirk that today would be the last day I defied her. She had a plan, she said, to end this once and for all. I leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed, waiting to hear the nonsense. Then she pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and told the dispatcher that I was refusing to comply with HOA orders and that the police needed to come enforce the law. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. She really thought the cops were going to show up, kick in my door, and haul me away for not paying her made-up fees. But Karen wasn't joking. She stood there with her phone to her ear, eyes locked on me, smiling with that twisted satisfaction of someone who believed victory was already in her hands. "We'll see how tough you are when the police drag you off your own porch," she hissed. She didn't realize that the world didn't revolve around her HOA, and she definitely didn't realize who she was picking a fight with. It didn't take long before the wail of sirens floated through the trees. Karen's face lit up like a child on Christmas morning, her grin wide, her chest puffed out as if she'd just summoned the cavalry. 2 police cruisers rolled down the gravel path, their tires crunching against the stones, lights flashing against the cabin walls. Karen turned to me with a triumphant look, practically bouncing with excitement. "This is it," she snapped. "Now you'll pay." She marched toward the cars, pointing furiously in my direction, her voice carrying across the yard as she shouted about laws, fines, and how I was refusing orders. She demanded they arrest me, demanded they remove me from my property, and ranted about how no one was above her authority. The officers stepped out, adjusting their belts, scanning the scene. Karen rushed up to them, pointing her finger at me like a prosecuting attorney. She went on, her words spilling out in a torrent about how I was defying the HOA, refusing to sign her contracts, refusing to pay, how I was destroying the community, how I was the worst kind of neighbor. She barked at them to do their jobs, to cuff me immediately, to teach me a lesson in obedience. Her face was red, her voice sharp, her hands shaking with excitement. She thought this was the moment she would finally win, the moment I would be forced to kneel to her will. But then something happened that Karen hadn't planned for, something that wiped the smugness off her face in an instant. The officers didn't reach for their cuffs. They didn't move toward me at all. Instead, their eyes met mine, and in perfect unison they straightened their posture. With a sharp movement, both men raised their hands to their brows in a salute. The kind of salute that isn't given lightly, the kind of salute reserved for respect, for recognition, for acknowledgement of someone they trusted more than anyone else on that lake. Karen froze, her fingers still midair, her mouth hanging open as the sound of silence pressed down on her. I gave the officers a nod, casual, like this was just another day. They greeted me by name, their tone warm, almost deferential. Karen's head whipped back and forth between us, her voice sputtering as she tried to process what she was seeing. She stammered, demanding to know what they were doing, why they weren't following her orders. "I called you here to arrest him," she screeched. "He's breaking the law. He's ignoring our HOA. He's a criminal." But her voice grew smaller with every word, because the officers weren't even listening. They were talking to me, asking about my family, checking in like old friends who respected the ground I stood on. Finally, one of them turned to her, his patience clearly thinning. He told her that my property wasn't part of her HOA, that she had no authority here, and that she had wasted their time by calling in a false report. The look on her face was priceless. The red drained from her cheeks. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She tried to argue, tried to claim she was in charge of the entire lake, that every house fell under her jurisdiction. But the officers weren't having it. One of them warned her that filing false police reports was a crime in itself, and that if she kept this up, she'd be the one riding in the back of the cruiser, not me. Her confidence cracked completely then. The proud woman who had strutted into my driveway minutes earlier was suddenly shrinking into herself, her eyes darting nervously, her shoulders collapsing as the realization sank in. She had been so certain she'd see me dragged away in chains, but instead she was the one being threatened with charges. And all the while, the officers continued treating me with respect. Their salutes a reminder of the bond between us, of the truth she had ignored all along. I wasn't just some neighbor she could bully. I wasn't just a man in a cabin. I was someone with a past, with a reputation, with connections that ran far deeper than her petty HOA rules could ever touch. When the cruisers finally pulled away, leaving her standing there on the gravel, the silence was deafening. She didn't scream anymore, didn't threaten, didn't wave her clipboard like a sword. She just stood there, red-faced and humiliated, watching as the authority she thought she owned slipped right through her fingers. She had called the cops to break me, but instead they saluted me, and that was the moment she finally understood the truth she had fought so hard to deny. She could never control me, never find me, never intimidate me. Her power ended at the edge of her neighborhood, and beyond that she was nothing more than a woman screaming into the wind. Karen had been circling my lake property like a hawk for months, always watching, always scheming, always finding new ways to remind me that she thought she ran everything within sight of the water. She strutted around with her clipboard and her sunglasses like she was mayor, governor, and judge, all rolled into one, convinced that her homeowners association gave her power over every soul in the area. The truth was simple. My land wasn't and had never been under her HOA. The lake cabin was mine, sitting on acres that predated her entire subdivision, and not one rule she wrote had any weight here. But Karen wasn't the type of person who let facts get in the way of her ego. She'd show up week after week, demanding I sign her paperwork, demanding I hand over fees, screaming that I was breaking community bylaws by daring to exist outside her reach. I ignored her, because dealing with her was like dealing with a barking dog. The more attention you gave, the louder it got. Ignoring her only fueled her obsession. Every refusal, every shrug, every quiet dismissal of her so-called rules drove her into deeper rages. And one morning she came storming down my driveway with that wild look in her eyes, the look of someone who thought she had finally found a way to win. She didn't even bother with her usual speech about property values or community harmony. She went straight for her phone, holding it high like a sword, and declared that she was calling the police. She shouted it loud enough for the entire lake to hear, practically daring me to stop her. She told me she would have me arrested for refusing to comply, that she would see me dragged off my porch in cuffs, that this would be the day she proved she was untouchable. I watched her with my arms crossed as she dialed 911, her voice sharp and shrill as she told the dispatcher that a defiant homeowner was refusing to join her HOA, refusing to follow her laws, refusing to obey. The dispatcher must have been confused, but Karen kept pressing, demanding that officers be sent immediately, demanding that action be taken, her voice trembling with triumph. She ended the call with a satisfied smile plastered across her face and turned to me with that smug look that only someone drunk on their own power can muster. It wasn't long before the distant wail of sirens reached across the lake, bouncing between the trees. Karen's grin grew wider with every second, her arms folded across her chest, her feet tapping with anticipation. 2 cruisers appeared at the end of the gravel road, lights flashing, tires crunching over stone. Karen all but danced in place, whispering to herself about justice being served, about order being restored, about how I was finally going to get what was coming to me. She met the officers halfway, nearly tripping over herself in her eagerness to play queen of the world. She pointed at me before they had even stepped out of their cars, her words spilling out in a feverish stream. She told them I was breaking the law, that I was refusing orders, that I was endangering the community by not falling in line. She demanded they arrest me, demanded they fine me, demanded they do something to make me submit. The officers listened quietly as she ranted, their eyes shifting between her frantic gestures and my calm stance on the porch. She barked at them to do their jobs, to put me in cuffs, to drag me off like a criminal. Her voice rose higher and higher, breaking with the effort, her face flushed with red. She thought she was moments away from the ultimate victory, from finally proving that even I couldn't resist her grip. Then the moment came, and it was not the one she had written in her mind. The officers exchanged a glance, then turned toward me. Instead of moving for their handcuffs, instead of following Karen's furious pointing finger, they straightened their backs in perfect unison. Their hands snapped to their brows, crisp and sharp, offering me a salute. Karen froze in place, her mouth hanging open, her eyes wide with disbelief. The smug smile drained from her face as if someone had pulled the plug on her confidence. The sound of her voice caught in her throat, and for the first time since I'd known her, she was completely silent. I nodded at the officers in return, greeting them by name. They addressed me with warmth, respect, the kind of tone that spoke of years of trust and recognition. Karen stood stiff, her head whipping back and forth between us, sputtering as she tried to understand what was happening. She shouted at them, demanding to know why they weren't arresting me, demanding to know why they were treating me like a friend instead of an enemy. She screamed that I was a criminal, that I was ignoring the law, that they needed to do something now. One of the officers finally turned to her, his patience worn thin. He told her plainly that my land was not part of her HOA, that she had no legal standing over me, and that she had wasted their time with a false report. The other officer added that making false calls to the police was itself a serious offense, and that if she ever tried it again, she might find herself in the back seat of a cruiser on her way to jail. Karen's eyes went wide, her hands fluttering as she stammered, trying desperately to claw back some of her authority. She insisted she was right, that she had jurisdiction, that everything near the lake belonged to her HOA. But her words sounded weak, brittle, like glass shattering under pressure. The officers ignored her protests and went back to chatting with me, asking about the family, checking if everything was fine, their voices casual and friendly. They had no interest in her bluster. Karen's face turned redder with every second, the humiliation sinking into her bones. She had envisioned me in cuffs, dragged away, broken under her control. Instead, she was the one shrinking, the one trembling under the weight of her failure. Her precious police backup had saluted me instead of obeying her, and that truth was a wound she would never heal from. As the cruisers pulled away, the silence that followed was almost sweet. Karen stood on the gravel, frozen, her clipboard dangling uselessly at her side. Her eyes darted between me and the empty road where her supposed allies had vanished. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, stripped of the power she thought she held. I didn't need to say a word. She knew. She had lost, and she would never win against me. That day, Karen learned the one lesson she should have known all along. Some people can't be bullied, some properties can't be controlled, and some men can't be broken. Karen had been circling like a vulture ever since the day I moved into my lake cabin, convinced that her homeowners association gave her authority over my land. She was relentless, showing up with a clipboard and a stack of papers she claimed were mandatory agreements, demanding I sign away my independence and hand her money for fees I never owed. She declared that I was breaking community rules by not joining, that my cabin was bringing down property values, that my refusal to obey would not be tolerated. I ignored her because my land had stood long before her little HOA existed, and nothing in her stack of papers could override the deeds, the titles, or the law. But Karen was not the type to back down when her ego was on the line. Each time I turned her away, her voice got louder, her tone got sharper, her threats more dramatic. She was addicted to control, and the sight of someone living free outside her grasp was more than she could stomach. She called me names, called me a squatter, called me a nuisance, but I stood my ground. And when words failed her, she decided to escalate. It was on a bright afternoon when she finally cracked. She marched down my gravel driveway, heels snapping against the stones, phone already in her hand. She didn't even bother with her usual pitch about bylaws or neighborhood harmony. She went straight into shouting that she was calling the police, that she was reporting a dangerous homeowner who refused to comply with community standards, that this would be the last day I disrespected her authority. Her face was red with fury, spit flying from her lips as she shouted every word loud enough for the trees to hear. I watched calmly as she jabbed numbers into her phone, her voice rising to a shrill edge as she told the dispatcher that I was refusing lawful orders, that I was a threat to the peace of the neighborhood, that officers needed to respond immediately. The satisfaction in her eyes was unmistakable, like she had just lit a fuse and was waiting for the explosion. The sirens came quickly, faint at first, but growing louder as they tore down the old county road. Karen was grinning, pacing back and forth, muttering to herself about how I was about to learn my place. Two cruisers rolled up the drive, lights flashing, tires crunching over gravel, and she practically skipped toward them, arms flailing as she pointed at me, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. She told them I was defiant, told them I was breaking every rule, told them I refused to join the HOA even though I was required to. She demanded they arrest me, demanded they fine me, demanded they put me in cuffs right there on my porch. She was vibrating with excitement, convinced her victory was at hand. The officers listened quietly, their eyes on her wild gestures, their expressions unreadable. Karen kept pressing, her voice rising higher, ordering them to do something, to act now, to prove her right. She barely stopped to breathe as she painted me as some kind of criminal mastermind undermining her perfect neighborhood. She didn't notice the way the officers' eyes shifted to me, the recognition in their gaze, the calm that radiated from their stance. And then it happened. They stepped back from Karen's storm of words, turned toward me, and in one smooth motion, both men raised their hands in a crisp salute. The sound that escaped Karen's throat was half gasp, half choke. Her smug grin shattered, her clipboard slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the gravel. She stood frozen, mouth wide open, staring at the officers as though she had just witnessed something impossible. I gave the men a nod and returned their salute, the respect between us clear as daylight. Karen stammered, pointing at me, shouting that this was wrong, that they were supposed to take me away, that they had no business saluting a lawbreaker. One of the officers finally turned to her, his patience worn thin, and told her flatly that my property was not under her HOA's jurisdiction, that I was within my full legal rights, and that she had wasted their time with a false report. Her face went from red to white in seconds, her lips trembling as she tried to argue. She insisted she was in charge, that the lake belonged to her HOA, that everything within sight of the water was under her control. The officers didn't buy it for a second. The second man told her that false calls to law enforcement were serious offenses, and if she pulled this stunt again, she might be the one riding in the back of a cruiser. Her hands fluttered helplessly, her voice breaking as she pleaded with them to listen, to enforce her rules, to make me bow to her authority. But her empire, paper rules, and shouted threats crumbled right there on my driveway. I stood silently, watching the woman who had tormented me for months finally face the weight of her own delusion. The officers turned their backs on her and walked over to me, their voices calm, respectful, asking how things were going, checking on the family, laughing about old times. They didn't give Karen another glance. To them, she wasn't worth the effort. Just another busybody wasting their time. She stood behind them, trembling with rage, her body shaking, her lips twisted in disbelief, and every second that passed was another nail in the coffin of her authority. When the cruisers rolled back down the drive, the silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Karen remained rooted to the spot, her clipboard abandoned in the dirt, her eyes darting between me and the empty road. For once she had no words, no threats, no clever insults. All she had was the bitter taste of humiliation, the memory of officers saluting the very man she had tried to destroy. She stumbled backward, muttering nonsense under her breath, her empire of imagined power shattered beyond repair. I didn't need to say a word. She knew. She had learned the truth the hardest way possible, that not everyone bends to a bully, not every property can be conquered by an HOA, and not every man bows to a self-appointed queen. The respect she had tried to steal was never hers to claim, and when she tried to take it by force, all she found was her own downfall. From that day on, she never walked my driveway again. Karen had made it her personal mission to force me under the thumb of her Lake Homeowners Association. From the first day she laid eyes on my cabin, she strode down the path like she owned the ground it stood on, demanding papers be signed, fees be paid, rules be followed. I told her calmly and repeatedly that my property was older than her subdivision, that the HOA had no legal claim over me, that the lake itself was shared public water, and my shorefront rights were untouchable. But Karen wasn't built to understand no. Every refusal made her angrier. Every quiet dismissal of her paperwork fueled her obsession. She spent weeks circling my land, snapping photos of my porch, scribbling in her little clipboard, muttering about bylaws and violations that didn't exist. She cornered neighbors, poisoning their ears with stories about me being a freeloader, a rebel, a danger to property values. And when none of that worked, she decided she would escalate it into something much bigger. That escalation came on a day when the lake was still, the water reflecting the trees like glass, and the air heavy with storm clouds. Karen stormed down the gravel with her phone already pressed to her ear, shouting loud enough for me to hear before she even reached the porch. She told the dispatcher that I was refusing lawful orders, that I was a danger to the community, that I was defying the HOA and creating chaos at the lake. She spoke as if she were a general reporting an enemy soldier, her tone frantic but laced with triumph, as if she had finally found the silver bullet to bring me down. She hung up with a smirk so smug it could have been carved from stone and folded her arms, announcing that I was about to be dragged away for good. Minutes later, the sound of sirens began to echo through the valley. Karen straightened her back, lifted her chin, her whole body trembling with the thrill of impending victory. 2 cruisers rolled in, lights flashing against the darkening sky, and she nearly skipped down the drive to meet them. She pointed at me before the doors were even open, her words spilling out in a torrent. She told the officers I was refusing to obey community rules, that I was defiant, that I thought I was above the law. She demanded they arrest me immediately, demanded they put me in cuffs, demanded they make an example out of me before the entire neighborhood. She spoke so quickly her breath came in gasps, but the sparkle in her eyes said she already believed she had one. The officers stood still as she ranted, their eyes calm, their expressions giving nothing away. She screamed louder, telling them they were wasting time, ordering them to do their duty, insisting this was a matter of law and order. Finally, they turned from her and looked at me, their gazes steady, familiar. And then they moved in unison, standing tall, lifting their hands to their brows in a sharp, clean salute. Karen froze as though lightning had struck her. Her face drained of color, her mouth hanging open. The clipboard she clutched slipped from her fingers and smacked against the gravel, the sound cutting through the silence like a gunshot. She stammered, pointing back and forth between me and the officers, shouting that this wasn't right, that I was the one breaking laws, that I couldn't possibly deserve respect. One of the officers turned to her with a hard look and told her plainly that my land was outside her HOA, that I had broken no laws, and that she had wasted their time with a false report. The words hit her harder than any blow could have. She shook her head, her lips trembling, insisting she was right, that the HOA covered everything near the lake, that they had to act on her orders. The second officer cut her off, his voice sharper, warning her that filing false police reports was a crime, and if she kept it up, she would be the one facing arrest. Her bravado collapsed in on itself. She sputtered weakly, tried to protest, but her voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. The officers turned from her without another word and walked over to me, their tones softening, their words friendly, asking how things were going, asking about the cabin, checking in like old friends. Karen stood there trembling with rage, her entire body shaking, her face twisted into a mask of disbelief. She had marched onto my property expecting to watch me hauled away, broken and defeated, and instead she had witnessed the exact opposite. The law she thought she could wield like a weapon had turned against her. The men she thought would be her enforcers had saluted the man she hated most. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, shrunken under the crushing weight of her own failure. When the cruisers rolled back down the gravel and disappeared into the trees, the silence that settled over the lake was thick and heavy. Karen remained rooted to the spot, staring at the empty road as if the world had stopped making sense. Her hands hung limply at her sides, her precious clipboard abandoned in the dirt, her lips moving but no words coming out. For the first time since she had declared war on me, she had no power left, no leverage, no voice. I stood tall on my porch, watching her crumble. She finally turned, her eyes darting to me, her face pale, her breath shallow. There was no more shouting, no more threats, no more speeches about bylaws and authority. She staggered backward, muttering something too quiet to hear, before retreating the way she came, shoulders slumped, her empire of paper rules and imagined power in ruins. And as she vanished up the road, I knew one truth would echo in her mind for the rest of her days. Some land cannot be conquered, some people cannot be bullied, and some men cannot be broken. Karen had always believed her homeowners association badge made her royalty at the lake. The kind of royalty who strutted around with a clipboard and a shrill voice, barking orders at anyone who didn't bow down to her bylaws. From the moment she first stomped up my gravel drive, she made it clear she thought my cabin, my land, and even the air around it fell under her rule. I told her calmly, again and again, that my property was older than her subdivision, that her HOA line stopped long before my fence, and that no contract in the world could force me into her little kingdom. She didn't like that answer, and each time I gave it to her she seemed to grow taller, louder, more determined to prove me wrong. She scribbled fake violations on her clipboard, snapped photos from the road like a gossip paparazzi, cornered neighbors with stories that I was a freeloader dragging everyone else down. Nothing in her arsenal worked, and when she realized intimidation wasn't enough, she decided to reach for her last weapon, the police. It was early afternoon when she came storming in, heels cracking against the gravel, sunglasses perched on her nose like she was an FBI agent on a mission. Her phone was already in her hand, her voice pitched high enough to echo across the lake. She screamed into the receiver that I was refusing lawful orders, that I was disobeying community leadership, that I was a threat to harmony and safety. She didn't say she was calling about an HOA dispute. No, she painted me like a criminal, a dangerous man who needed to be put in his place. When she ended the call, her smile stretched from ear to ear, confident that this was finally the day I would be humbled. She folded her arms, glaring at me, spitting out that I was going to jail, that the world would see her victory, that soon I'd be forced to pay every fee she'd ever dreamed up. Not long after, the sirens came, first as a faint hum, then louder, until two cruisers pulled into view, red and blue lights flashing against the tall trees. Karen nearly danced in place, her whole body jittering with excitement, as though Christmas morning had arrived early. She ran to meet them before the engines were even off, her arms flailing, her words pouring out like a flood. She pointed at me, her voice shaking with rage and triumph, shouting that I was a criminal refusing to comply, that I thought I was above the law, that they needed to slap cuffs on me right there and drag me off my porch. She didn't even give them space to speak, barking at them like they were her personal soldiers sent to enforce her will. The officers stood quietly, watching her, their faces unreadable. They let her rant, let her stomp and jab her finger, let her unleash the torrent she had been building for months. Then their eyes shifted to me. Karen followed their gaze, expecting them to storm up the porch and demand my surrender. Instead, in one clean motion, both men squared their shoulders, raised their right hands, and snapped into a crisp salute. The sound that came out of Karen's mouth was half gasp, half scream. Her eyes went wide, her jaw dropped, and the precious clipboard she clung to slipped from her hand and clattered to the stones. She looked from the officers to me, back again, her brain trying to process what had just unfolded. I gave the salute back, calm and steady, and the recognition in their eyes said it all. They knew me, respected me, owed me more than Karen could ever imagine. She started shouting again, desperate now, insisting this was wrong, that I was the one in violation, that they had to do something. One officer turned to her, his patience evaporating, and told her flatly that my property was not part of her HOA, that I had broken no law, and that she had wasted their time with a false report. Her face drained of color, the smug mask collapsing. She tried to argue, sputtering that the HOA controlled the entire lake, that the bylaws extended everywhere, that I had to obey. The other officer cut her off, his tone sharp enough to slice through her delusion, warning her that filing false reports was a serious crime, and that if she ever pulled this stunt again, she might be the one riding in the back of their cruiser. Her hand shook, her lips trembled, and the power she thought she wielded shriveled into nothing. They turned their backs on her without another word and walked toward me, their voices shifting to warmth, checking in on the family, asking about the cabin, talking like old friends, sharing a moment on a porch instead of dealing with a petty complaint. Karen stood there, quivering, her whole body a statue of rage and humiliation. She had expected handcuffs and humiliation from me, but instead she was the one exposed, powerless, ignored. The law she thought she commanded had saluted the very man she tried to crush. When the cruisers finally pulled away and the sound of their engines faded into the trees, the silence that followed was thick, almost heavy. Karen remained rooted in place, staring at the empty road as if waiting for it to make sense again. Her clipboard lay forgotten in the dirt, the wind flipping its empty pages. She looked smaller, diminished, her shoulders sagging, her chin trembling. For the first time since she began her crusade, she had no speech, no voice left. She staggered backward a few steps, eyes darting toward me with something that almost looked like fear. Without a word, she turned and marched away, though her stride was no longer proud or commanding. It was broken, uneven, hollow. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. She had finally been shown that some land is beyond her reach, some men are beyond her power, and some truths cannot be rewritten no matter how loudly she shouts them. The lake was quiet again, the trees rustling in the breeze, the water rippling gently. Karen's empire of imagined authority had crumbled right there on my gravel, and she knew it. From that day on, she never came back down my drive.